A gloved hand seized Martha Hale's coat sleeve as thunder rolled over the spring prairie. Leather tightened hard between them, stopping the old widow rancher mid-step. Wind hurled cold rain across the empty yard and rattled her barn doors. The stranger stood there, mud to his knees, breath rough from hard miles. A sealed letter pressed hard into her palm. From Jacob Hale, the man rasped. Martha's heart struck once like a hammer. Jacob Hale had been buried 10 winters ago. The storm cracked open above them, and the letter felt warm in her hand. Rain slapped the barn roof in steady, hollow blows. The loose windmill vanes spun crooked above the yard, knocking metal against metal with every hard gust. Martha Hale stood in the mud beside the empty cattle pen and watched the storm roll across her land. 30 years she had worked this soil. 10 of those years alone. The prairie answered her now with cold wind and hollow silence. The barn doors banged once in the gale. Boom. The sound rolled across the yard like a slow gunshot. Martha did not flinch. She had heard worse sounds since Jacob Hale was lowered into frozen ground behind the house. Hoofbeats once. Deputies twice. And the quiet scratching of bankers' pens that took more land than bullets ever did. The wind pushed harder. Rain crawled down the back of her collar. Her gloved hands stayed locked around the old fence rail. Inside the house a chair still sat empty at the supper table. Jacob's chair. She had never moved it. Never filled it. The windmill clanged again above her. Clack. Drag. Clack. A broken rhythm. Like something struggling to keep turning. Martha finally stepped toward the house. Her boots sucked free from the mud with wet, stubborn sounds. The porch boards groaned under her weight as she climbed the steps. Creak. The same boards Jacob once swore he would fix every spring. He never had the chance. Her hand touched the door latch. Cold iron. For a moment she stood there listening to the storm sweep across the fields. Nothing moved out there anymore. No riders. No cattle. No voices drifting across the prairie at dusk. Just wind. Just rain. And the slow dying of a ranch that once fed half the valley. Then something caught her coat sleeve. A hard grip. Leather tightening suddenly against her arm. Martha turned. A man stood at the foot of the porch steps, soaked through and breathing like a horse pushed too far. Mud climbed to his knees. His hat hung low over tired eyes. In his hand was a folded envelope sealed with cracked red wax. The wind snapped the paper corner against his knuckles. Tap. 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 The man lifted it toward her. For Martha Hale. His voice rasped like gravel under wagon wheels. Martha did not move. Who sent it? She asked. The stranger swallowed once. Rain slid down the brim of his hat. Jacob Hale. The name struck the quiet yard harder than thunder. Jacob Hale had been buried 10 winters ago. The windmill clanged again above them. Clack. Drag. Clack. The stranger swayed once on his feet. Martha stepped forward before he could fall. The letter pressed cold against her palm. She opened the door. The porch boards creaked behind them as the stranger crossed the threshold into her house. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud. Wind clawed once at the boards. Then the storm stayed outside. The house held a different silence. Warmth lived here. Faint. Thin. But alive. The stranger staggered 2 steps across the kitchen floor. Wet boots left dark prints on the planks. Drip. 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 Rain slid from his coat and tapped against the floor like slow clock ticks. Martha caught his arm before his knees gave way. He was heavier than he looked. Muscle under the soaked canvas. Hard miles in every bone. Chair, she said. The word landed flat in the quiet room. She pushed him toward the table. The chair legs scraped the floor. Screech. The sound filled the house too loudly. The stranger sat hard. Wood creaked under his weight. His breath came in rough pulls. Like a bellows pulled too fast. Martha placed the letter on the table. The wax seal glowed dull red in the lamplight. She did not open it. Not yet. Her eyes stayed on the man. "You rode far?" He nodded once. "3 territories." His voice dragged through gravel. Martha crossed to the stove. The iron door groaned open. Inside, the coals still breathed. Orange light. Soft heat. She fed the fire with 2 dry sticks. The wood caught slowly. Crack. Pop. Warmth pushed outward through the room. The stranger lifted his hands toward it. They shook slightly. Long fingers. Scarred knuckles. Hands that knew rifles and reins. Steam rose from his coat. The smell of wet leather filled the kitchen. Martha poured water into a kettle. The tin lid rattled as she set it on the stove. Clink. Behind her the windmill outside clanged again. Clack. Drag. Clack. The stranger looked toward the sound. "Wind's been chewing that vein for years. Jacob used to curse it," Martha said. Silence followed. The fire popped again. The stranger studied the table. His gaze stopped on the empty chair beside Martha's. Jacob's chair. He understood. Men who ride long roads learn to read rooms. He looked away. Names Daniel Cross. Martha Hale. Another silence. The kettle began to murmur. Low. Steady. Like breath returning to a tired chest. Martha set a cup before him. Steam curled upward. Daniel wrapped both hands around it. Heat soaked into his fingers. He drank slowly. Eyes half closed. "Jacob saved my life once," he said. The words dropped gently. Like stones in deep water. Martha's shoulders stiffened. "Where?" "Fort Sumner Trail." The kettle hissed harder behind them. Daniel stared into the cup. "Bandits had me pinned in a canyon wash. 2 rifles. Nowhere to run." He swallowed. "Your husband came over the ridge alone." The fire cracked sharply. Martha listened. Still. Daniel rubbed his jaw. "Never asked my name. Just started shooting." The wind struck the house outside. Boards groaned. The sound rolled through the walls like distant thunder. Daniel kept talking. "After it was done, he handed me a canteen. Then he handed me that letter." His eyes flicked to the envelope on the table. "Sealed already. 10 years ago." Martha finally looked at the wax. Her heart tapped once. Heavy. "You carried it that long?" Daniel nodded. "Jacob made me swear." "What kind of oath lasts 10 years?" "One given to a dying man." The words settled slowly in the warm kitchen. The fire softened. Rain thinned outside. The house listened. Martha picked up the envelope. The paper felt stiff. Old. Yet the seal held firm. Jacob's mark pressed deep into the wax. She traced it with her thumb. The windmill clanged again. Clack. Drag. Clack. Daniel watched her carefully. He said trouble would come. Martha's eyes lifted. "What trouble?" "Men who buy land with ink and lies." Her jaw tightened. That sounded too familiar. Daniel leaned back slowly. The chair creaked. "He told me you'd be alone when they came." Martha stared across the table. "Did he now?" The firelight flickered across the walls. Shadows moved gently. The kitchen felt warmer now. Alive again. Yet something cold slipped under the door with the wind. A reminder. The prairie did not forget debts. Outside the storm eased. Rain softened to a whisper. The windmill slowed. Clack. Pause. Clack. Daniel's gaze drifted toward the window. A long moment passed. Then he spoke again. "I'll ride out at first light." Martha said nothing. The kettle sighed softly. Steam curled through the air. Daniel pushed the empty cup away. "Did my part." You'll have your letter. And whatever Jacob wanted you to know." He rose slowly. His legs steadied now, strength returning with the warmth. But when he reached the door, a deep cough caught him. Hard. Rough. He braced one hand against the wall. The sound echoed through the quiet house. Martha watched him, studied the mud still drying on his boots, the exhaustion under his eyes, the miles in his bones. A man who had ridden through 3 territories to keep a promise. The wind pushed softly against the door. Outside, the prairie stretched dark and wide. No town nearby. No doctor. No shelter for 50 miles. Daniel reached for the handle. Martha spoke before he touched it. "You'll freeze before the road reaches the river." He paused. Her voice stayed calm. "You can take the spare room." Daniel turned slightly. "You sure about that?" Martha nodded once. "Storm hasn't finished arguing with the plains." The windmill answered outside. Clack. Drag. Clack. Daniel let go of the door. The house breathed warmer. For the first time in years. There were 2 sets of footsteps moving across the floor. Morning crept into the house through thin curtains. Gray light. Cold night. The fire in the stove had fallen to dull red coals. Tick. Tick. The kettle lid shifted gently as the last heat breathed out. Martha Hale stepped into the kitchen with quiet boots. The floorboards whispered under her weight. Creak. She paused. Another sound moved through the house. Not wind. Not rain. A steady rasp of breath from the spare room. Daniel Cross was still alive. That surprised her more than she expected. Most men who rode through storms like that did not rise easy the next morning. Martha stirred the coals with an iron poker. Ash lifted softly. The fire answered with a small flame. Crack. Pop. Warmth crawled slowly back into the room. Outside, the storm had passed. The prairie lay washed clean and white beneath a pale sky. Water dripped from the barn roof. Plink. 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 The windmill turned slower now. Clack. Pause. Clack. Still crooked. Still stubborn. Like the ranch itself. Martha poured coffee grounds into the pot. The smell rose strong and bitter. The kind Jacob liked. She froze. That thought came too easily. 10 years and the habit still lived in her hands. The spare room door opened behind her. Wood scraped gently. Daniel stepped into the kitchen. His movements were careful. Every muscle stiff from the road. But his eyes were clearer now. Morning. His voice carried less gravel. Martha nodded toward the chair. Coffee. He sat. The chair creaked under his weight. Scree-eek. Daniel wrapped his fingers around the tin cup Martha slid across the table. Steam curled upward. Warmth met cold skin. He closed his eyes briefly. Like a man greeting sunlight after a long tunnel. "You always wake before the sun?" he asked. "Ranch used to." She poured her own cup. The coffee tapped softly against the metal. Tap. 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 Daniel studied the kitchen. Old cabinets. Dust along the windowsill. The empty chair at the table. Jacob's chair. Still waiting. "You keep the place running alone?" he asked. "Enough to keep it standing." Silence settled between them. The kind that belongs to houses used to holding more voices. Daniel took another drink. Outside, a loose shutter banged once against the wall. Bang. Both of them glanced toward the sound. The wind was rising again. A thin spring wind. Sharp with leftover winter. Daniel pushed his chair back. "I should earn that bed you gave me." Martha watched him stand. "You still ride like a dead man. Still breathe though." He stepped toward the door. The floorboards creaked under his boots. Outside, the yard looked different under morning light. Storm mud. Broken fence rail. A gate hanging crooked. The ranch had been losing ground for years. Daniel stepped off the porch. His boots sank slightly into the wet earth. Schlook. He studied the pasture. Empty. Fence wire sagged between leaning posts. Barn roof missing 2 shingles. Work everywhere. Martha stood beside him. Cold wind tugged at her coat. "You planning to ride today?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "Horse needs rest. And I owe you some labor." He walked toward the fence line. The wire trembled softly when he touched it. Ting. "Tension's gone," he said. "Posts rotting too." He pushed one gently. The wood leaned another inch. Storm would have taken this down soon. Martha crossed her arms. "Storm's been trying for 10 years. Daniel gave a quiet grunt. He pulled a knife from his belt. Cut a length of spare wire. The metal snapped tight with a sharp sound. Ping. Work began slowly. Hammer blows soon echoed across the yard. Clang. 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 The sound carried across the prairie like a signal fire. Martha stood on the porch watching. The ranch had been quiet too long. The hammer noise stirred memories in the old boards. Clang. 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 Daniel worked steady. Post after post. Wire pulled tight again. The windmill turned overhead. Clack. Drag. Clack. Time moved forward with every strike. Then Daniel stopped suddenly. His head tilted toward the hills beyond the pasture. Martha followed his gaze. Dust moved far out along the ridge road. Just a thin ribbon. Too distant to see riders. But dust like that meant hooves. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow. "You get many visitors out here?" "Not the kind worth greeting." The dust faded again. Wind swallowed it. Maybe a wagon. Maybe nothing. Still. The prairie had spoken. Daniel drove one last nail into the post. Clang. The hammer echo died slowly across the valley. He leaned against the fence rail. Breathing steady now. "You read the letter yet?" Martha's hand rested in her coat pocket. The envelope sat there. Heavy. Waiting. "Not yet." Daniel looked toward the house. "Jacob didn't send it for decoration." "I know." Wind moved through the pasture grass. Soft whisper. The ranch listened. Martha finally turned toward the porch. "I'll read it tonight." Daniel nodded. The windmill creaked overhead. Clack. Pause. Clack. Somewhere far beyond the hills, another faint sound drifted across the land. A distant hammer. Or maybe a rifle shot. Daniel glanced toward the ridge again. The prairie had long ears. And trouble had a habit of traveling slow. Evening settled slow over the ranch. The sky burned orange behind the western hills. Then the color drained away. Cold returned with the dark. Inside the house the stove crackled strong. Wood popped. Warmth filled the kitchen walls again. Martha Hale sat at the table. The letter lay before her. The red wax seal glowed in the lamplight. Daniel cross-leaned against the far wall. Arms folded. Quiet. The house carried a new sound tonight. 2 breaths instead of 1. Outside the windmill turned. Clack. Pause. Clack. Martha ran her thumb along the edge of the envelope. The paper rasped softly against her glove. 10 years. 10 years sealed inside that thin fold. Daniel shifted his weight. Boot leather creaked. "You've been staring at it all day." "I've waited 10 years without knowing it." That letter rode 3 territories to reach this table. Martha exhaled slowly. The room smelled of coffee and burning oak. She slid a knife under the wax seal. The blade cracked the hardened red. Snap. The sound echoed louder than it should. Daniel straightened. The fire popped sharply in the stove. Crack. Martha unfolded the paper. The writing was rough. Heavy strokes. Jacob Hale's hand. Her breath caught once. Just once. Then she read. The windmill outside groaned. Clack. Drag. Clack. Daniel watched the lines of Martha's face. Stone first. Then something softer. Then tight again. What does he say? Martha read one line twice. Slow. Careful. He says trouble will come. Daniel gave a quiet nod. Expected that part. He says men with money will ride here. Daniel pushed off the wall. The floorboard groaned under his step. Creak. Did he give a name? Martha shook her head. Not yet. The paper rustled softly in her hands. She read again. The fire hummed steady. Warm against the cold creeping through the window glass. Daniel walked closer to the table. He stayed standing. Respectful distance. What else? Martha's voice stayed low. Jacob wrote this the night he left for the North Drive. Daniel listened. He said if this letter ever reached me, it meant he failed to come home. The stove cracked again. Pop. Daniel looked toward the empty chair beside Martha. Jacob's chair. Still waiting. What did he leave you besides warnings? Daniel asked. Martha turned the page. The paper whispered. He wrote about the land. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Land brings trouble faster than gold. Martha kept reading. He said this ranch carries something certain men will try to take. Daniel leaned closer. And? Martha stopped reading. Her finger rested on the final line. Outside the wind rose. It pushed against the barn roof. Boards groaned. The windmill rattled harder. Clack. Drag. Clack. Daniel watched her carefully. What does the last line say? Martha read it aloud. Trust the man who carries this letter. Silence followed. Heavy. Daniel looked down at the table. Jacob always did trust strange men. You earned that trust somehow. Maybe. Martha studied him now. Long. Careful. You ever wonder why he picked you? Daniel shrugged once. Closest rider still breathing. Martha folded the letter slowly. But something slipped from the fold. A second paper. Thicker. Older. It slid onto the table with a dry scrape. SHHHK. Daniel's eyes narrowed. That wasn't there when he gave it to me. Martha picked it up. The parchment felt heavier. Official. A faint stamp pressed into the corner. The ranch brand burned into the wax seal. Daniel stepped closer. What is it? Martha turned it toward the lamplight. The paper glowed pale gold under the flame. Her eyes scanned the writing. Then stopped. Daniel heard her breath catch. Sharp. What? Martha didn't answer. Outside the wind gusted suddenly. The windmill clanged harder. Clack. 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 Like warning bells over the prairie. Daniel reached the table. His shadow fell across the document. What does it say? Martha swallowed. Her voice came slower now. He wrote this deed 5 days before he died. Daniel froze. The fire popped again. Hot sparks rattled inside the stove. Martha traced the ink signature at the bottom. Jacob Hale. Clear. Certain. This ranch isn't registered the way the county thinks it is. Daniel's brow lowered. That sounds like trouble. It sounds like protection. Another gust hit the house. The window rattled in its frame. Rattle. Rattle. Daniel glanced toward the dark prairie beyond the glass. You said men with money were coming. That's what Jacob believed. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. I've seen those kinds of men. They don't knock politely. The wind died down again. Silence returned slowly. The fire hummed steady. Warm. Alive. Martha folded both papers carefully. The letter. The deed. She slid them back into the envelope. The paper rasped softly. Daniel watched every movement. You planning to hide that? For now. Smart. The windmill outside slowed again. Clack. Pause. Clack. Martha placed the envelope beside the lamp. Light touched the wax seal again. 10 years of silence finally broken. Daniel stepped back toward the wall. You might want to sleep with a rifle tonight. Martha looked toward the door. The prairie lay black beyond the porch. Wide. Quiet. Too quiet. The windmill turned once more. Clack. Drag. Clack. Somewhere out there. Men were already riding toward that sound. Morning came sharp and bright. Cold sunlight spilled across the yard. Frost clung to the fence wire like thin glass. The windmill turned slow above the barn. Clack. Pause. Clack. Daniel Cross stood beside the fence line with a hammer in his hand. The metal head struck the nail. Clang. The sound traveled across the open pasture. Clear. Lonely. A working sound on land that had nearly forgotten it. Behind him the house door creaked open. Martha Hale stepped onto the porch. Steam curled from the coffee cup in her hands. Warm breath drifted into the cold morning air. Daniel glanced toward her. Fence will hold another season. Martha nodded once. Good. The pasture grass bent under a light wind. Dry stalks whispered together. Ch, ch. The ranch felt quiet. But not peaceful. Daniel sensed it first. A faint vibration through the ground. Hooves. Distant. Still far beyond the ridge. But coming. Daniel's eyes lifted toward the horizon. Dust rose slowly above the road. Thin. Spreading. Martha followed his gaze. Her jaw tightened. How many? Daniel watched the movement carefully. 3. Maybe 4 riders. The hammer lowered slowly in his hand. The windmill clanged again above them. Clack. Drag. Clack. The dust cloud thickened. Shapes formed inside it. Horses. Men. Riding steady. Not lost travelers. Men riding with purpose. Daniel wiped his hands on his coat. Visitors. Uninvited. The riders crossed the last ridge. Sunlight flashed on a rifle barrel. Another flash from a saddle buckle. The lead rider slowed as they reached the yard. Hooves crunched on frozen dirt. Crunch. Crunch. The horses stopped beside the gate. Leather creaked. Harness chains rattled. Daniel leaned one arm against the fence post. Casual. But ready. The lead rider swung down from the saddle. Boots hit the ground with a hard thud. He wore a dark coat. Fine wool. Too clean for ranch work. A silver watch chain gleamed across his vest. His eyes swept across the property. The barn. The pasture. The house. Calculating. He smiled faintly. Mrs. Martha Hale, I presume. His voice carried smooth polish. City tone. Not frontier dust. Martha stepped off the porch. The boards groaned under her boots. You presume correct. The man removed his hat. A gesture that looked polite. But his eyes stayed cold. Victor Langley. He gestured toward the riders behind him. 2 deputies. Both wearing county stars. Daniel's gaze flicked to those badges. Metal glinted in the sun. Langley continued speaking. I apologize for the early visit. No you don't. Langley's smile widened slightly. No. I suppose I do not. He reached into his coat. Paper rustled softly. SHHHK. He unfolded a document. Official stamp. County seal. Daniel recognized the look. Paper that steals land. Langley held it out. This ranch is now under legal transfer. Martha did not move. Langley read from the page. Due to outstanding debts and unpaid county claims. His voice carried easily through the cold air. This property now belongs to Langley Land Holdings. The wind lifted slightly. Fence wire hummed softly. Ting. Ting. Daniel studied Langley's face. No hesitation. No doubt. Just quiet ownership. Martha folded her arms. I don't remember selling. Langley tilted his head. The county remembers for you. One of the deputies shifted in his saddle. Leather creaked. The horse snorted softly. Warm breath rolled into the morning air. Daniel stepped closer to the gate. The dirt crunched under his boots. You came a long way to wave paper. Langley glanced toward him. His eyes lingered a moment. Judging. Weighing. And you are? Just a man fixing fences. Langley smiled thinly. Temporary employment, I suspect. Daniel shrugged. Depends who owns the fence. Langley tapped the paper. I do. Silence stretched across the yard. The windmill creaked overhead. Clack. Drag. Clack. Langley folded the document again. Mrs. Hale, I am not unreasonable. He slipped the paper back into his coat. You have 3 days. Martha stared at him. 3 days for what? To leave. The words fell soft. Final. Behind Langley the deputies shifted again. Their horses stamped the frozen ground. Thud. Thud. Langley continued calmly. After that time, the property will be reclaimed with assistance from the county. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had heard that tone before. Men who buy law like ammunition. Martha stepped closer to the gate. Cold wind tugged at her coat. My husband built this ranch. Langley nodded politely. Yes. And now I own it. Daniel's hand rested lightly on the fence rail. The wood creaked under his grip. Creak. Langley glanced at the repaired fence line. Impressive work. Waste of effort though. Daniel said nothing. Langley turned toward his horse. He placed one boot in the stirrup. Paused. Then looked back. Oh, one more thing. His eyes flicked toward the house. Toward the lamplit window. Men sometimes arrive here claiming old promises. Daniel felt the weight of that sentence. Langley smiled again. If such men are present. His gaze settled directly on Daniel. They would be wise to ride away. Leather creaked as he swung into the saddle. The deputies turned their horses. Hooves crushed the frost. Crunch. Crunch. Langley tipped his hat once more. 3 days, Mrs. Hale. The riders turned toward the road. Dust rose behind them. Slow. Certain. The windmill clanged above the ranch again. Clack. Drag. Clack. Daniel watched the riders disappear beyond the ridge. The hammer still hung in his hand. Cold metal against his palm. Martha spoke quietly beside him. You planning to ride now? Daniel looked at the empty road. Then at the house. The barn. The broken pasture. He dropped the hammer into the dirt. Thud. No. The windmill turned once more. Clack. Pause. Clack. The riders vanished beyond the ridge. Dust drifted slowly down behind them. Silence crept back across the ranch. Not the peaceful kind. A thin silence. Sharp around the edges. The windmill turned above the barn. Clack. Pause. Clack. Daniel Cross stood at the fence line long after the road emptied. The hammer lay in the dirt beside his boot. Cold iron catching the sun. Martha Hale remained near the gate. Arms folded. Eyes fixed on the horizon. The prairie stretched wide and bright under the morning sky. Too calm. Daniel finally bent and picked up the hammer. The metal felt heavier now. Like work had changed shape. They'll come back, he said. Martha nodded. They always do. She turned toward the house. The porch boards creaked under her steps. Creak. Daniel followed slower. The wind tugged gently across the pasture. Fence wire hummed faintly. Ting. Ting. The sound carried across the quiet land. Inside the kitchen the stove still held warmth. The coals glowed dull red. Martha poured coffee into 2 cups. The kettle lid rattled softly. Clink. Daniel sat at the table. The chair creaked under him. The house felt smaller now. Like walls were listening. "You know that man?" Martha asked. Daniel wrapped his hands around the cup. Warm steam drifted up. "Not him personally. But I know his kind." Martha waited. Daniel stared into the dark coffee. "Victor Langley doesn't buy land. He harvests it." Martha's eyes stayed steady. "Explain." Daniel leaned back. Wood groaned under the chair. 3 years ago. South of Santa Fe. Family ranch about the size of yours. Their water rights vanished overnight. He rubbed his jaw slowly. County papers said the land was already sold. To Langley. The wind outside brushed the house walls. Soft. Restless. Martha sipped her coffee. "He steals land with paperwork. Paper and men with rifles." Daniel nodded toward the ridge. "Those deputies? Probably on his payroll." Silence filled the kitchen again. The stove cracked softly. Pop. Warmth moved through the room. But something colder settled behind the words. Daniel leaned forward. "Your husband knew something. That letter wasn't a guess." Martha reached into the drawer beside the stove. The envelope slid across the table. Paper rasped softly. Daniel glanced at the seal. Jacob Hale's mark. Still strong after 10 years. "You read the whole thing?" he asked. "Every line." "And the deed?" Martha tapped the envelope once. "Still inside." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "That document is the only thing keeping Langley from walking through that door." Martha lifted her chin. "He already thinks he owns the place." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's why he gave you 3 days." Martha studied him. "Not charity." "No." Daniel looked toward the window. The pasture glowed pale under the rising sun. Quiet. Too quiet. He wants time to be certain. Certain of what? That no one is coming to stop him. The windmill clanged outside again. Clack. Drag. Clack. Daniel's gaze followed the sound. Men like Langley don't rush. They tighten ropes slow. Martha folded her hands on the table. "So what do we do?" Daniel looked at her carefully. "We." The word hung in the room. He glanced toward the door. His saddle rested on the porch rail. His horse grazed near the barn. He could ride away. Still could. The road remained open. The prairie had many directions. Daniel exhaled slowly. "First thing. We make sure this ranch isn't easy to take." Martha raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" Daniel stood. The chair legs scraped loudly across the floor. Screech. He walked to the door. Cold air slipped inside when it opened. The yard looked different now. Like a battlefield waiting for its soldiers. Daniel stepped onto the porch. The wind tugged at his coat. He studied the fence lines. The barn. The well. "Langley will test the place first," he said. "How?" "Small things. Cut wire. Spook cattle. Maybe poison the well." Martha joined him on the porch. Her boots tapped softly on the boards. "And after that?" Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the prairie. "Then he comes with law and rifles." The windmill creaked overhead. Clack. Pause. Clack. Martha leaned against the rail. "Jacob trusted you." Daniel gave a quiet breath. "Jacob saved my life." "Same difference." Silence returned. The kind that sits between two people deciding something dangerous. Far across the prairie a faint sound drifted through the wind. Hoofbeats. Distant. Slow. Daniel turned his head slightly. Listening. The rhythm faded again. Maybe travelers. Maybe scouts. The prairie never spoke without reason. Daniel stepped off the porch. Boots crunching gravel. "I'll check the north fence." Martha watched him walk toward the pasture. The hammer swung loose in his hand. Clang. Clang. Each strike carried across the open land. Work. Preparation. The ranch had been quiet for too long. Now the sound of iron returned. Clang. 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 The windmill answered above it. Clack. Drag. Clack. And somewhere beyond the hills, men were already measuring the distance back. The second morning arrived colder. Wind pushed low clouds across the prairie. The ranch woke under a gray sky. Daniel Cross stood near the north fence line. Wire cutters in one hand. A broken strand of fence wire hung loose before him. The metal curled like a dead snake in the grass. He lifted the end. The cut was clean. Sharp. Not storm damage. He stared at it a long moment. Then the windmill turned above the barn. Clack. Pause. Clack. Daniel exhaled slowly. First test. His voice carried across the empty pasture. Martha Hale stood behind him with a coil of spare wire. Boots planted steady in the dirt. They wasted no time. Daniel knelt beside the fence post. The wood still held strong. He threaded new wire through the staples. Metal rasped. "Scrrk. Langley's men ride nights," he said. Quiet. Looking for weak spots. Martha handed him the pliers. Their fingers brushed once. Cold skin. Cold morning. Daniel twisted the wire tight. Ping. The line pulled straight again. Strong. For now. The wind rose across the pasture. Grass bent low. Fence wire hummed softly. Ting. Ting. Daniel stood and scanned the ridge. Nothing. Just empty prairie rolling toward the horizon. But the cut wire spoke louder than any rider. Someone had come in the night. Someone had watched the house. Martha turned slowly toward the barn. "You checked the cattle pen?" Daniel nodded once. They walked together across the yard. Boots crunched frost underfoot. Crunch. Crunch. The barn door creaked open. Creak. Inside, the smell of hay and horses filled the air. Warm breath drifted from the stalls. Daniel's horse lifted its head. Snorted softly. A second stall stood empty. But the gate latch hung loose. Daniel stepped closer. The metal chain swayed slightly. Clink. Clink. "Gate was shut last night," Martha said. Daniel examined the latch. Scratches cut into the iron. Fresh marks. Knife work. They opened it. Why? To see if the horses would bolt. Daniel looked toward the pasture. The animals still stood calm. Whoever came had left quietly. Testing. Watching. He closed the latch again. The chain snapped tight. Clack. Martha's voice stayed calm. "They're patient." Daniel brushed hay dust from his coat. Men who steal land usually are. The wind pushed against the barn walls. Boards groaned. Low. Restless. Daniel stepped outside again. The sky had darkened slightly. Clouds gathering. Another storm maybe. Or just heavy weather passing through. The windmill clanged above the barn roof. Clack. Drag. Clack. Martha followed him toward the well. The bucket rope creaked as she pulled it up. Creak. Water sloshed softly inside the wooden pail. Daniel watched her lower the bucket again. The rope slid through the pulley. Whir. Then the sound stopped. Martha froze. Her nose wrinkled slightly. Daniel stepped closer. "What is it?" She lifted the bucket slowly. Water sloshed again. But the smell reached them before the bucket cleared the rim. Sharp. Bitter. Daniel leaned over. His eyes hardened. Oil floated across the water's surface. Thin black streaks twisting in the sunlight. "Damn." Martha set the bucket down hard. Wood thumped against the well stones. Thud. They poisoned it. Daniel crouched beside the rim. He dipped a finger carefully. Rubbed the oil between thumb and skin. Coal oil. Cheap. Easy to carry. Hard to remove from water. "Not enough to kill," he said. "Just enough to ruin the well." The wind whipped across the yard. Cold against their faces. Martha stared into the bucket. 3 days. Daniel nodded slowly. "They want the ranch empty before Langley returns." Silence stretched across the yard. The barn creaked. The windmill turned again. Clack. Pause. Clack. Daniel wiped his hand on a rag. "We'll haul water from the creek. That's 2 miles. Then we walk." Martha gave a short breath. "Langley's men expect us to pack." Daniel looked toward the ridge again. His eyes narrowed. Dust rose faintly along the far trail. Riders again. Too far to count. But enough to know someone watched the ranch. Daniel straightened slowly. "They're circling. Let them watch." Martha lifted the bucket and dumped the ruined water onto the dirt. The oil spread dark across the dust. The smell lingered sharp in the air. Daniel walked toward the barn. He returned with 2 rifles. One he handed to Martha. Wood stock warm from the barn. The weight settled firm in her hands. She checked the chamber without hesitation. Click. Loaded. Daniel leaned his rifle against the porch rail. The metal glinted faintly. "Fence will hold," he said. "For now." Martha set the bucket beside the door. "We've held worse than fences." The wind moved stronger across the prairie. Clouds rolled lower. The ranch stood quiet under the gray sky. But the quiet carried tension now. Daniel climbed the porch steps. Boots thudding against wood. Thud. Thud. He rested both hands on the rail. Eyes scanning the horizon again. Somewhere out there. Langley's riders waited. Counting the hours. The windmill clanged above the roof. Clack. Drag. Clack. The sound echoed across the empty land. A lonely rhythm. But not alone anymore. The third morning came with iron skies. Cold wind pushed across the prairie like a blade. The ranch stood silent beneath it. Daniel cross-leaned against the porch rail. Rifle resting across his forearms. His eyes stayed on the ridge road. Waiting. The windmill turned above the barn. Clack. Pause. Clack. Inside the house the stove burned low. Martha Hale stepped onto the porch with the envelope in her hand. The old paper felt heavier today. Daniel glanced at it. "You ready?" Martha nodded once. The wind tugged at her coat. The prairie answered with dust. A long line of it. Rising over the ridge. Hoofbeats rolled across the ground. Distant. Then closer. The rhythm thickened. Thud. 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 Daniel lifted the rifle slowly. Not aiming yet. Just ready. 3 riders became 5. Then 6. Victor Langley rode at the front. His dark coat snapped in the wind. 2 deputies rode beside him. 3 hired men behind. Rifles resting easy across their saddles. The horses slowed as they reached the gate. Leather creaked. Metal jingled softly. Langley dismounted first. Boots struck the dirt. Thud. He brushed dust from his sleeve. Eyes sweeping across the ranch. The repaired fence. The barn. The porch. Daniel standing there. Martha beside him. Langley smiled faintly. I hoped you'd be sensible. The wind pushed through the yard. Fence wire hummed. Ting. Ting. Martha stepped forward. Boots crunching gravel. You gave us 3 days. Langley glanced at the sun. We're on the third. Daniel remained still. The rifle rested easy across his arms. Langley nodded toward it. That's unnecessary. Daniel's voice stayed calm. So is stealing a ranch. One of the hired riders chuckled. Langley silenced him with a glance. Then he reached into his coat. The same folded paper appeared again. The county seal flashed in the gray light. I brought witnesses this time. He gestured toward the deputies. Both men watched carefully. Hands resting near their holsters. Langley unfolded the paper. The wind snapped its corner sharply. Flap. Flap. Mrs. Hale. His voice carried smooth authority. This document gives me full claim to this property. Martha said nothing. Langley stepped closer to the gate. Cold wind whipped through the yard. The windmill rattled harder. Clack. Drag. Clack. Langley held the paper higher. All lawful. Daniel spoke quietly. Law written by thieves still reads like theft. Langley's smile thinned. You misunderstand your position. He gestured toward the riders behind him. 6 rifles. 2 deputies. And a legal document. Daniel shifted slightly. Boots grinding gravel. Still looks like theft. Langley sighed. Very well. He folded the paper again. This can be unpleasant. The riders behind him straightened in their saddles. Leather creaked. Rifles shifted. The Prairie held its breath. Then Martha lifted the envelope. Paper rustled softly in the wind. Langley's eyes narrowed. What's that? A letter. Langley chuckled softly. I doubt a letter outranks county law. Martha opened the envelope slowly. The paper rasped against her fingers. Daniel felt the tension ripple through the riders. One man leaned forward slightly. Curious. Langley watched carefully now. What exactly do you think you're doing? Martha unfolded the deed. The thick parchment caught the gray light. The ranch brand burned red in the seal. Langley's smile faded. Daniel saw the change first. Langley's eyes sharpened. Martha spoke clearly. This ranch was transferred legally 10 years ago. Langley laughed once. Short. Sharp. Impossible. Not according to this. She held the document higher. The wind snapped its edge. Flap. Flap. One deputy leaned from his saddle. His eyes scanned the paper. Recognition flickered across his face. Langley noticed. His voice hardened. Give me that. Martha didn't move. Daniel lowered the rifle slightly. But his finger rested near the trigger. Langley stepped toward the gate. Boots scraping dirt. You think some old scrap of paper changes anything? Martha's voice stayed steady. It changes everything. The windmill clanged louder above them. Clack. Drag. Clack. Langley's temper cracked. He shoved the gate open. The hinges screamed. Screech. Daniel lifted the rifle. The barrel leveled at Langley's chest. Silence slammed into the yard. Cold. Absolute. Langley froze mid-step. The hired riders shifted nervously. Leather creaked. One man's horse snorted. Hot breath in the cold wind. Daniel spoke quietly. You stop right there. Langley stared down the rifle barrel. His jaw tightened. You'd shoot a man with deputies watching? Daniel's voice stayed calm. I'd stop a thief. One deputy cleared his throat. His gaze still fixed on the deed. That seal looks legitimate. Langley shot him a glare. Quiet. The wind rose suddenly. Dust swirled across the yard. The deed snapped again in Martha's hand. Flap. Flap. Langley's eyes flicked between the rifle and the paper. His confidence thinned. Just a little. Daniel took one step forward. Boot crunching gravel. If that document stands, you're trespassing. Silence again. Long. Heavy. The windmill turned above them. Clack. Pause. Clack. Langley slowly stepped back. The rifle never moved. The riders watched their leader. Waiting. Calculating. Langley mounted his horse again. Leather creaked as he pulled himself up. He stared down at Martha. Then Daniel. You've bought yourselves time. His voice carried cold promise. But this isn't finished. He turned the horse sharply. Hooves tore dirt from the yard. The riders followed. Dust rose behind them. Slow. Certain. Daniel lowered the rifle. The prairie swallowed the hoofbeats again. The windmill clanged above the ranch. Clack. Drag. Clack. Dust slowly settled over the ranch. The hoofbeats faded beyond the ridge. Silence returned. Not empty silence. The kind that follows a storm. Daniel Cross lowered the rifle beside the porch rail. Metal tapped the wood softly. Tick. Tick. The wind moved across the prairie again. Cool. Clean. The windmill turned above the barn. Clack. Pause. Clack. Martha Hale still held the deed in both hands. The parchment trembled slightly in the wind. Daniel stepped down from the porch. Boots crunching gravel. Crunch. Crunch. He stopped beside the gate. Eyes still fixed on the ridge where Langley had vanished. They'll be back. Martha folded the deed slowly. The paper rasped softly. They already were. Daniel looked at her. The tension had not left his shoulders yet. The prairie had a way of carrying trouble back twice. Martha slipped the deed into the envelope again. Her hand steadied now. Come inside. Daniel hesitated. His gaze moved across the pasture. The repaired fence. The poisoned well. The barn. Signs of a ranch that had fought for every season. Finally he followed her up the porch. The boards creaked beneath their steps. Creak. Inside the kitchen the stove glowed warm again. Orange firelight danced along the walls. The kettle hummed softly. Warmth pushed back the cold air that followed them inside. Martha set the envelope on the table. The same table where it had first landed. 10 years of silence folded into that paper. Daniel removed his coat. Hung it over the chair. The chair legs scraped softly. Screech. He sat slowly. Every muscle still tight. You said the ranch isn't registered the way the county thinks. Martha nodded. She poured 2 cups of coffee. Steam curled upward between them. The smell filled the kitchen. Strong. Steady. Daniel wrapped his hands around the cup. The warmth seeped into his palms. Tell me the rest. Martha opened the envelope again. The letter slid free first. Then the deed. The parchment rested flat on the table. Daniel leaned closer. The ranch brand seal glowed dark red. Martha tapped the bottom line. Jacob signed this 5 days before he died. Daniel studied the ink. The handwriting was strong. No hesitation in the strokes. He transferred the land. Daniel's brow lowered. To who? Martha looked up at him. To me. Daniel blinked once. That part's normal. Not the rest. She slid the letter toward him. The old paper crackled softly. Daniel unfolded it. The fire popped in the stove. Crack. He read the final lines again. Trust the man who carries this letter. Daniel looked up. I always wondered why he wrote that. Martha leaned back slightly. The chair creaked under her. He knew Langley would come. Daniel nodded slowly. Langley's been buying half this valley. Not buying. Taking. Martha pointed to the map sketched in the corner of the deed. Daniel leaned closer. Thin ink lines crossed the paper. Ridge. Creek. Pasture. Then one small mark near the north boundary. Daniel frowned. What's that? A water spring. Daniel's eyes lifted quickly. Hidden? Martha nodded. Jacob found it the year before he died. Daniel leaned back slowly. Wood groaned beneath the chair. That explains everything. Martha folded her hands. Langley isn't after the ranch. He's after the water. Daniel stared toward the window. The prairie beyond the glass looked dry. Endless grass. Dust and wind. A hidden spring down in the north draw could change the whole valley. It would water 10 ranches, Daniel said quietly. Martha nodded once. That's why Jacob hid the deed. Daniel tapped the table softly. If Langley owned this land, he'd own the only year-round water for 50 miles. Silence settled again. Heavy. The wind pressed against the house walls. Low. Restless. Daniel rubbed his jaw slowly. So Jacob sent me with proof. Martha watched him carefully. He trusted you to arrive when Langley finally showed his hand. Daniel gave a quiet breath. He always did think ahead. The windmill clanged outside again. Clack. Drag. Clack. Daniel looked toward the sound. That spring still safe? For now. Langley doesn't know about it. Not yet. Daniel stood slowly. The chair legs scraped across the floor. Screech. He walked to the window. The prairie stretched wide beyond the glass. The ridge road lay empty again. But not peaceful. Never peaceful anymore. If Langley finds that spring, he'll come back with more than 6 riders. Martha joined him at the window. Their reflections moved in the glass beside the dark prairie. He'll come with the county. Maybe the railroad too. Daniel's jaw tightened. Water meant power. Power meant men like Langley never stopped. The windmill creaked again. Clack. Pause. Clack. Daniel turned back toward the table. Toward the letter. Toward the deed. You ever wonder why Jacob chose me to carry this? Martha shook her head. You said he saved your life. Daniel gave a quiet smile. More than that. He rested his hand on the table. The old wood warm under his palm. Langley's men were the bandits in that canyon. Martha's eyes sharpened. Daniel nodded slowly. Jacob knew who they worked for. The fire popped again behind them. Sharp. Bright. Daniel lifted the deed carefully. The parchment felt solid. Real. Your husband knew this fight was coming. Martha looked toward the dark horizon again. And he left you here when it did. Daniel folded the deed back into the envelope. His voice came steady. No. He placed the envelope on the table. He left me here too. Outside the windmill turned again. Clack. Drag. Clack. The sound no longer felt lonely. Spring arrived slowly on the prairie. Morning light spread gold across the pasture. The wind carried warmth now. Not winter's bite. Something softer. The windmill turned above the barn. Clack. Pause. Clack. Daniel Cross stood near the north draw. Shovel in the dirt. The ground here felt different. Cool. Damp beneath the surface. He drove the blade down again. Thunk. Soil lifted. Dark. Rich. Behind him Martha Hale leaned on the fence rail. Watching. The prairie stretched wide around them. Green pushing through winter grass. You were right, Daniel said. Martha nodded toward the shallow trench. Water shimmered there. Clear. Cold. Alive. The hidden spring had finally been opened. The water slipped quietly across the rocks. Trickle. Trickle. The sound felt strange on this dry land. Like a secret speaking aloud. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow. Sunlight warmed his shoulders. Langley would have killed for this. Martha looked toward the distant ridge. Quiet now. Empty for weeks. He tried. Daniel leaned on the shovel. You think he'll come back? Men like Langley don't forget land. Daniel nodded. But his eyes drifted across the pasture. Toward the cattle grazing near the creek. 20 head now. More than the ranch had carried in years. Work had returned to this place. And so had life. A hammer rang near the barn. Clang. Clang. Old Eli Carter swung the tool steady against a fence post. The neighboring rancher had arrived 2 weeks ago with help and lumber. News of Langley's attempt had spread faster than the wind. Frontier folks remembered their own battles. Eli's grandson ran across the yard chasing a stray chicken. Boots thumping the dirt. Thud. Thud. The boy laughed. The sound carried across the ranch like birds returning after winter. Daniel listened a moment. The ranch no longer felt empty. Martha pushed away from the fence rail. Her boots crunched the gravel. You planning to stand there all morning? Daniel grinned slightly. Just admiring the water. Water doesn't fix fences. He shouldered the shovel. They walked back toward the house. The porch boards creaked under their weight. Creak. The front door stood open. Warm air drifted out. Inside the kitchen the stove burned bright. Coffee steamed on the table. Jacob Hale's chair no longer stood empty. Daniel had fixed the broken leg weeks ago. Now it held a place again. Martha set 2 cups beside the pot. The kettle had rattled softly. Clink. Daniel sat down. The chair creaked. But it held. Warmth filled the room. Outside the windmill turned steady. Clack. Drag. Clack. The same sound that once echoed across a lonely ranch. Now it blended with other noise. Hammer blows. Children's laughter. Cattle lowing in the pasture. Life had returned in pieces. Daniel lifted his cup. Steam curled into the morning light. You ever read the letter again? Martha nodded. Every Sunday. Daniel leaned back. Wood creaked under the chair. What do you think Jacob would say now? Martha looked toward the window. Sunlight touched the pasture grass. Gold. Quiet. He'd say the ranch survived. Daniel smiled faintly. He'd say you're stubborn. That too. Outside the hammer rang again. Clang. Clang. Eli shouted something to his grandson. The boy laughed. Daniel listened. The prairie sounded different now. Full. Alive. Not just wind and empty miles. Martha poured more coffee. The dark liquid tapped softly into the cup. Tap. 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 Daniel rested his hands on the table. The wood felt warm beneath his palms. You planning to keep me around? Martha raised an eyebrow. You planning to leave? Daniel glanced toward the door. His saddle still hung on the porch rail. But dust had settled across it. The road had not called him in weeks. No, he said. Didn't think so. The wind moved through the yard. Fence wire hummed softly. Ting. Ting. The windmill turned again above the barn. Clack. Pause. Clack. Daniel listened to the rhythm. Once it had sounded lonely. Like a broken clock over an empty ranch. Now it blended with the creek's quiet water. The hammer's steady work. The voices in the yard. A living sound. Martha lifted her cup. The morning sunlight warmed the kitchen walls. You hear that windmill? Daniel nodded. Been hearing it since the day I rode in. It doesn't sound the same anymore. Daniel tilted his head. Listening. The blades turned smooth against the breeze. Clack. Drag. Clack. Not lonely. Just steady. like a heartbeat across the land. Daniel smiled into his coffee. Sounds like home. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.